Alrighty, NBC Youth, here we go. Week 4, I think it's week 4. So our 4th video, I've got good old James Boyer here with me today to help answer some questions and think about next week. Well, if you got your Bible in front of you, the first question is referring to chapter 6, verse 5, which we read last week. The question is about Jesus when he's in his hometown. Why does it say that Jesus couldn't do any miracles in his own hometown? Why couldn't he do any miracles? I'll read the verse to you. He could not do any miracles there. Pretty straightforward. Why does it say that? Could Jesus really not do any miracles? I thought he was God. I thought he could do whatever he wanted. Well, if you have a look at the rest of the verse, it actually says, except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. So even though it says he can't do any miracles, he actually ends up doing some pretty astonishing miracles. So I think that when it says he couldn't do any miracles, it's a hyperbole, it's an exaggeration. Meaning he didn't do many miracles, but none at all. And even if you look at the verse earlier, verse 2, it says that the people say, what are these remarkable miracles he is performing? So obviously even the people in his hometown have already seen him do miracles. But I think the point of this text is actually to say that there's something very dangerous about being super familiar with Jesus. The people who lived with him, who grew up with him, they see him preaching and they see him doing miracles and they kind of just shrug their shoulders and go, so what? And I think the danger is for us that we can be too familiar with Jesus as well. I think for a lot of us who grow up in church, we hear the story of Jesus raising a dead person or feeding 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and we kind of go, so what? And the danger for us is that we actually ignore who Jesus really is because we're so familiar with him.
So the second question that we got from this week is, how did Jesus manage to feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish? Like, that seems crazy. Like, did he shrink their stomachs and they only had like a tiny little grain of bread and fish each? Or
Yeah, like that movie that just came out where everyone kind of becomes these tiny little kind of doll-sized people.
Like mini-me kind of thing? Yeah. So, practically, like, how does it even happen? And I think the answer to that, it isn't specifically said in the Bible, but I think the answer comes in the point of this story and the whole purpose of this story. And we see that straight after this story, we see, Jesus feeds 5,000 people, and then he goes and walks on water out to the disciples and like calms his storm and stuff. And right after he's walked out to the disciples on the water, in Mark chapter 6, verses 51, 52, it says, they were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. So these guys are amazed at this miracle of Jesus walking on the water, and they hadn't understood about who Jesus was. I think this is important here because Jesus' claim here is to be God, to be the creator. And therefore, because he is God and the creator, therefore, I think it's implied from the purpose of this story that he multiplied the bread and created. And you notice there's even 12 baskets left over. So he's created, and he's created in abundance.
Okay, so the preview for this week, it starts with, the first thing we're going to look at is the story where it says Jesus honors a Syro-Phoenician woman's faith. Now, the first thing I want you to realize is somebody who's from Syrian Phoenicia, is not a Jew. They are a Gentile. They're somebody who doesn't belong to Israel. They're not the people of God as the Old Testament describes them. And what's important about this story is that Jesus, as the story goes on, he actually opens up the family of God to include people who are not Israel. So if you have a look at it, verse 27, verse 26, she begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. First let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. It's a pretty heavy comment there from Jesus, but what he's saying is, if Israel are the children of God, let's not take the bread that belongs to the children and feed it to the animals, which is the Gentiles. And I don't think Jesus is trying to be rude or derogatory there. I think he's actually he's taking the image of a household, and in a household, children are the priority above the animals. And so he's kind of saying that the Jewish people are the priority above the Gentiles. But then what this woman does is she says, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And so she says, that might be the case, but I still want your blessing. And so Jesus says, for such a reply, you may go, the demon has left your daughter. And he blesses her. This is one little glimpse of the fact that Jesus lets everybody into his family. He is not exclusive. He wants anyone to join the family of God. And that's important for us to remember as we start Mission Month through March, which starts this week at Youth, the 2nd of March, when we're heading to the water slides. This is a time for us to be inviting our friends along because we want them to meet Jesus, because Jesus doesn't exclude anyone. He wants everyone to be in his family. So I want to remind you this week, pray for your friends who aren't Christians and invite them along to Youth so they can hear about Jesus.
Straight after we hear from the Syrophoenician woman, it's really interesting. We see Jesus, chapter 7, verse 34, he heals this deaf man. He says, and heals this deaf man. And then not long after that, in chapter 8, verses 22 and onwards, we see Jesus then heals a blind man. So he's healing deaf people, he's healing blind people, and in between, he asks the disciples, I'm looking at chapter 8, verses 18, do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? Really interesting that he wedges that in between.
Yeah. So it's almost as if Jesus is accusing them of being deaf and blind. What's really fascinating after that, after Jesus says they're deaf and blind, is that you have the turning point in the whole book of Mark. Chapter 8, verse 27 to 33 is the turning point that we've been talking about the whole way through. The first half of Mark is about who is Jesus. The second half is about why did Jesus come. And here's the turning point where Jesus says, who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah. And all of a sudden, this blind guy can see. He sees the truth. He knows that Jesus is the Messiah. And that's the kind of turning point of the scriptures. But what's very interesting about Peter is he's kind of like the blind man in the story just above. Even though he sees, he doesn't see perfectly yet. Because Jesus describes what the Messiah must do, verse 31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. That's what the Messiah has to do. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. So even though Peter gets it, he doesn't quite get it yet. He's a bit confused, and so Jesus tells him off. But I think that's important for us to keep in mind. This is the turning point. So the rest of the gospel, the rest of our readings after this week, are going to be about what Jesus came to do. So keep that in mind as you're reading throughout the week, and I hope God blesses you through it. Catch you later.
Stay classy, Narrabeen Youth.